You know, when we think about a survival kit, we usually picture something very tangible, like a heavy plastic box you keep in the trunk of your car.
Right, like an emergency go bag.
Exactly. You've got your waterproof matches, a reflective thermal blanket, maybe a flashlight with one of those kinetic crank handles.
Oh, yeah, and probably a bottle of iodine water purification tablets, which is absolutely essential for biological continuation.
Yeah, you need that stuff to keep your biological functions going when the power grid fails or, the hurricane hits. It keeps your body alive when the environment turns hostile.
It does. Clean water, warmth, basic first aid.
Yeah.
But that kind of kit assumes a specific type of disaster.
How do you mean?
Well, it assumes the storm will pass and the rescue helicopters will eventually arrive. It assumes the underlying structure of society is still there.
Right. But think about your own Tuesday morning commute or your evening routine and try to imagine a disaster that isn't just a weather event.
A total collapse.
Exactly. What happens when it's the complete and total collapse of your entire civilization? Like your neighborhood is burned to the ground, your national leaders are dragged away in chains.
And every institution you relied on, your banks, your government, your places of worship, is just demolished.
Yes,
Yeah.
completely gone. And then you are forcibly relocated to a completely alien empire hundreds of miles away where you don't speak the language and you have zero social standing.
Yeah, a thermal blanket is definitely not going to save your identity in that scenario.
Not at all. In that kind of total systemic collapse, you need a different kind of survival kit entirely.
You really do. You need a psychological, cultural, and a spiritual survival kit.
You need a mechanism to keep your collective memory and your community's identity alive when all the physical landmarks of that memory have literally been reduced to ash.
Which is incredibly hard to do.
It is, and that brings us to what we are unpacking today. We are taking a deep dive into a profoundly fascinating collection of ancient texts.
Specifically, we are exploring a comprehensive survey of the third major division of the Hebrew Bible.
Right, it's a collection known simply as the writings, or in the original Hebrew, the Ketuvim.
The Ketuvim. And our mission today is to completely deconstruct this anthology. We want to discover how it functioned as an ancient post-crisis survival guide.
And more importantly, what wisdom it offers you right now for navigating life in a broken, unpredictable world.
Because it is deeply relevant to us today. To set the stage for this, if you look at the traditional structure of the Hebrew Bible, it is divided into three distinct parts.
Right, the Tanakh.
Exactly. First, you have the Torah, the first 5 books, which functions as the foundation.
That's like Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and so on.
Yes. It gives the people of Israel their creation story, their ancestral origins, and their covenant law. It basically tells them who they are.
It's the foundational rulebook.
Right. Second, you have the prophets, and these books serve as the fierce conscience of the nation.
They are constantly calling out systemic injustice, interpreting the people's failures, and warning of impending judgment.
Like flashing red warning sirens.
Exactly. So, if the Torah is the rulebook and the prophets are the warning sirens, you might naturally expect the third section to be some neat, tidy summary.
You think so? A neat bow tying it all together.
But the writings totally defy all expectations. This isn't a dusty philosophical treatise or a sterile list of dogmas.
Not at all. It is an emotionally raw, deeply practical, and sometimes violently contradictory toolkit for surviving catastrophe.
It really feels jarring when you read it alongside the other parts.
Because it is addressing a fundamentally different crisis. I mean, the Torah tells you who you are supposed to be.
And the prophets tell you what you did wrong to cause the disaster.
Right. But the writings answer the ultimate agonizing question: what do you do after everything falls apart?
When the dust settles on the ruins of your life, how do you actually put one foot in front of the other?
It's incredibly pragmatic.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because calling it a collection almost feels like we're shortchanging it.
It really does.
When you really dig into the history of this era, you realize we aren't talking about a single narrative arc written by one guy sitting in a tent.
Oh, definitely not. We are talking about a massive, sprawling anthology. It is incredibly diverse in its literary genres.
Like, what are we talking about here?
Well, you have soaring devotional poetry, you have dense philosophical wisdom discourse.
Just a huge mix.
Yeah, and there are liturgical collections meant to be sung by thousands, alongside really short, intimate historical narratives.
Oh, wow.
There are apocalyptic visions of the end of the world, and there is post-exilic historiography.
Meaning, like, history written by people trying to rebuild after an exile.
Exactly. Exactly. And the timeline is just staggering. The individual books in this collection date from the early monarchic period. Think the 10th century BCE, the era of King David.
Okay, so really old.
Very old, all the way into the Persian and Hellenistic periods centuries later.
So we're talking about hundreds of years of material. I was trying to think of how to describe this to someone today, and it honestly reminds me of a perfectly curated mixtape.
A mixtape, I like that.
Yeah. You know, when a friend is going through a terrible, life-altering breakup or a massive loss, and you make them a playlist.
Right, you want to help them process it.
Exactly. But you don't just put on 15 upbeat pop songs to cheer them up, because that feels totally tone-deaf to their pain.
It would just feel insulting.
Yeah. So you put on a song for when they just need to sit in the dark and cry. Then you put on a heavy, aggressive track for when they're furious.
You capture all the emotions.
Right. You put on a quiet, steady rhythm to help them just get out of bed in the morning, and finally, maybe a song to give them a glimmer of hope.
That is a brilliant analogy.
That's what the writings feel like to me. It's a compilation of different voices, moods, and perspectives gathered over centuries.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that mixtape analogy is highly illustrative of how canonization actually works.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, the traditional canonical shape of the writings isn't arbitrary. It was carefully organized.
Okay.
It starts with Psalms, moves through Proverbs and Job, then hits the 5 Megillah, which are Song of Songs, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and Esther.
That's quite a lineup.
It is. Then it moves to Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and finally ends the entire Hebrew Bible with Chronicles.
Right, and that's the question I kept returning to when I was looking at the sources. If this is a massive, diverse collection of different books assembled over hundreds of years by different authors, is there a deliberate reason it is structured exactly that way?
That is the big question.
Like, did scribes just stack the scrolls on a shelf in whatever order they happened to finish copying them?
Not at all. What's fascinating here is that the arrangement is a profound theological statement in itself.
Really? Just the order of the books?
Yes, by deliberately starting the collection with the songs and intentionally ending it with chronicles, the later Jewish communities who finalized this canonical reflection were sending a highly specific message to the reader.
Okay, what's the message?
They are framing Israel's entire post-disaster survival strategy. It places worship at the absolute front, and it places a memory of restoration at the back.
Wow. Worship at the front, memory at the back. That is brilliant.
It is deeply intentional. The Psalms represent the ultimate comprehensive vocabulary of prayer and praise. It teaches a traumatized people how to speak to God again.
It reorients them.
Exactly. And Chronicles, as the closing book, is a theological retelling of Israel's entire past, from Adam all the way to the decree that allowed the exiled people to return home.
So it's giving them a framework to understand their whole story?
Yes. It teaches the community how to remember their history, how to repent, and how to keep the door of hope propped open.
But to really feel the weight of why this specific survival mixtape was so desperately needed, we have to look directly at the massive historical catastrophe that forced its creation.
We absolutely do.
We have to talk about the trauma that permanently scarred their collective psyche.
We cannot overstate the trauma of the early 6th century BCE, because you really cannot understand the theology of the writings without understanding the geopolitical nightmare of the year 586 BCE.
Or 587, depending on the exact chronological dating, right?
Right, there is some debate there. But that year is the hinge on which their entire civilization broke.
Let's trace how they got there, because the contrast is what makes it so devastating.
It was a huge fall from grace.
Yeah. If we rewind to the 10th century BCE, we are looking at the height of the Davidic monarchy. This is their golden age.
Oh, absolutely. Under King David and his son, King Solomon, you have centralized, unified power. You have a massive economic boom.
They were thriving.
And most importantly, you have the construction of the first temple in Jerusalem.
Which was a massive deal.
It was everything. This was the era where many of the royal and liturgical traditions that eventually became the songs originated.
Because the temple was not just a building, right?
Yeah. No, it was the literal geographical epicenter of their religious, national, and ethnic identity. It was considered the place where heaven and earth intersected.
So you feel totally secure. You have a king from the line of David on the throne. You have an impenetrable city, and you have God's house right in the middle of it.
You feel invincible.
But then the geopolitical tectonic plates start to shift. First, the northern kingdom falls to the Assyrian Empire in 722 BCE.
Which had to be a massive shock to the system.
Yeah, a huge wake-up call. But the true paradigm-shattering blow comes over a century later.
The rise of the Neo-Babylonian Empire under King Nebuchadnezzar. They sweep across the ancient Near East, and they lay siege to Jerusalem.
And we need to understand ancient siege warfare.
We do. This wasn't a quick political transition.
No, this was months of starvation, disease, and terror. Just awful stuff.
Exactly, culminating in the Babylonians breaching the walls. And they don't just conquer the city, they completely annihilate it.
They literally burn the first temple to the ground.
They dismantle the architecture of their faith. And then the Babylonians employ their standard imperial policy. They deport the surviving population.
Just pack them up and move them.
Yeah. The royal family, the priests, the scribes, the skilled artisans, the intellectuals, they are all marched hundreds of miles east to Babylon. This is the exile.
It is the absolute end of the world as they knew it. I mean, the monarchy that God promised would last forever.
Yeah.
Gone.
Gone.
The temple where God supposedly lived,
Mm.
a pile of smoking rubble. They are a defeated people living in a foreign superpower's backyard.
Which is exactly why the writings became so vital.
Right, because how do you make sense of that?
How do you worship a God who apparently couldn't defend his own house? Or worse, how do you worship a God who intentionally allowed his house to be destroyed because of your systemic failures?
That is a terrifying thought.
That is the core theological crisis of the exile.
But the historical timeline doesn't stop in Babylon, right? Decades later, in 538 BCE, there is another massive geopolitical earthquake.
The Babylonians get overthrown.
Yes, the Persian Empire, led by Cyrus the Great, conquers Babylon. And Cyrus institutes an imperial policy that fundamentally alters human history.
He issues a decree allowing various displaced, exiled peoples to return to their ancestral homelands and rebuild their sanctuaries.
Which is huge. And this wasn't just for the Judeans, right?
No, this was a broad Persian strategy. The goal was to create loyal, grateful vassal states on the edges of their empire. It was smart politics.
But the result was that by 515 BCE, the returning Judean exiles managed to clear the rubble and complete the Second Temple in Jerusalem.
It's a miraculous turn of events.
And this historical pivot isn't just a biblical claim. It is backed up by some incredibly solid external archaeology.
It really is.
I want to look closely at the Cyrus cylinder, because this is an external pagan artifact that perfectly illuminates the world of these biblical texts.
The Cyrus cylinder is arguably one of the most important archaeological artifacts of the ancient world.
What exactly is it?
It is a barrel-shaped clay cylinder inscribed in Babylonian cuneiform, and it is dated precisely to 539 BCE, immediately following Cyrus's conquest of Babylon.
Oh, wow. So right at that exact moment in history.
Yes, it currently resides in the British Museum.
And what does it actually say? Because it's essentially a piece of ancient political propaganda.
Right. It is entirely a royal inscription celebrating Cyrus as a liberator.
Naturally.
But its value to our deep dive is that it explicitly outlines his imperial policy. In the text, Cyrus boasts about returning images of gods to their sanctuaries and gathering displaced peoples to restore them to their homes.
That perfectly matches the biblical account.
It perfectly corroborates the geopolitical background we see in biblical books like Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles.
So it proves that the environment the biblical writers were operating in was historically accurate. It's the Persian policy that made their physical return possible.
It absolutely illuminates the historical framework. However, this raises an important question about how we use archaeology, and we must exercise some interpretive caution here.
Okay, what do you mean?
Finding the Cyrus cylinder does not prove the theological claims of the Hebrew Bible.
Right, because the biblical writers claim that God moved the heart of Cyrus
Yeah.
to issue this decree.
Exactly. The clay cylinder obviously doesn't mention Yahweh moving Cyrus's heart. It mentions the Babylonian gods.
Okay, so archaeology rarely proves theology.
Right. What the cylinder does is provide the exact historical, social, and textual setting in which these biblical texts were lived out, compiled, and eventually finalized.
It gives us the when and the how, while the biblical authors are focused on the who and the why.
Perfectly said.
Speaking of text being finalized, there's another massive archaeological discovery we need to tackle: the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Oh, this is a fascinating area.
We've all heard the pop culture version, shepherds throwing a rock into a cave in Qumran and finding ancient jars filled with scrolls.
Right, dating from the 3rd century BCE to the 2nd century CE.
They found fragments of every single book of the Hebrew Bible except for the book of Esther.
Which is a whole other mystery.
Right. But when you look at the specifics, Particularly a scroll known as the 11Q Psalms scroll found in Cave 11 things get really complicated
The 11 QPSA scroll is a fascinating textual witness.
because it contains psalms in a non-canonical sequence, meaning the songs are out of the order that we have them in our modern Bibles.
Yes, the order is quite different in the latter parts of the scroll.
And not only that, it includes extra hymns that aren't in the final biblical canon at all. So I have to play devil's advocate here.
Go ahead.
Does finding a scroll with the wrong order and extra songs mean the Bible was just being made up as they went along? Like, if the playlist is constantly changing, how could they view it as sacred?
Well, that is a very modern anxiety, and it projects our modern concept of a printed, bound book onto an ancient oral and scribal culture.
Okay, that makes sense.
The discovery of 11 QPSI does not mean the texts were being made up. What it demonstrates is the textual plurality and the complex collection history of the Psalms.
Plurality, meaning there were multiple versions of the playlist floating around simultaneously.
Yes, particularly in sectarian communities, like the one at Qumran, which had separated itself from the Jerusalem temple establishment.
So they were doing their own thing to some extent.
For them, even into the 1st century CE, the microstructure of the Psalter was still somewhat fluid. The individual songs themselves were considered deeply sacred and authoritative.
But the overarching compilation, the exact order of the playlist, was still being organized.
Exactly.
So it was a truly living playlist.
Precisely. The post-exilic community was actively using these texts. They were praying them in the ruins, singing them during the rebuilding, and their scribes were gradually organizing them under theological guidance.
And eventually, it did settle into a final form.
Yes, the core traditions were remarkably stable, which we see confirmed centuries later by highly accurate medieval manuscripts like the Aleppo Codex from the 10th century CE.
But the Dead Sea Scrolls give us a snapshot of the canon in motion, solidifying its final shape.
They let us see the process.
And the final shape of that theology was deeply, undeniably influenced by the cultural reality they were physically living in.
It permeated everything they wrote.
This trauma of displacement to Babylon and the subsequent return under Persian rule didn't just change their geography. It radically altered the daily social dynamics they had to survive.
You really can't read the writings as detached, abstract theology.
No, you have to read them through the lens of ancient Near Eastern societal structures, kinship households, agrarian life, honor-shame dynamics, and patronage systems.
If you strip away that sociological context, you miss the profound grit of these texts. These concepts are not just background set dressing, they form the skeletal structure of the narratives.
So let's translate some of this for the modern ear. What does this all actually mean for us?
Well, let's look at patronage systems.
Okay, when I read about the patronage systems operating in the imperial courts of Babylon or Persia, which is the exact setting for a book like Daniel or Esther, I immediately compare it to navigating a wildly toxic modern corporate ladder.
That is a very apt comparison.
Like, imagine you work for a massive, unfeeling, multinational conglomerate. Your literal survival, your paycheck, your healthcare depends entirely on getting favor from the CEO.
Right.
But you can't just email the CEO. Your access is heavily mediated by mid-level managers and executives who might want to steal your ideas or throw you under the bus to advance their own careers.
It's cutthroat.
Totally. So you need a patron. You need someone higher up to vouch for you, and in return, you owe them absolute loyalty.
That analogy captures the pervasive anxiety of the ancient imperial court perfectly. In Babylon or Susa, access to the king, and therefore access to power, resources, and physical safety, was heavily mediated by patrons.
You needed favor to survive.
Exactly. Daniel and Esther are ethnic minorities trapped in a massive imperial machine. They are trying to maintain their covenant fidelity to their god while navigating a political system that could execute them on a whim if they offend the wrong patron.
And interwoven with that patronage is the honor-shame dynamic, which, again, translates so easily today.
It really does.
I think of the brutal, unforgiving public square of modern social media. In the ancient world, public honor and public humiliation weren't just about your feelings. They dictated your actual social and economic survival.
Yes. If you were publicly shamed, you were socially dead. No one would trade with you. No one would marry into your family.
You were an outcast.
You see this dynamic everywhere in the writings. Think of Job. Job's suffering is undoubtedly physical, but the true agony of the book is the profound public shame.
Because everyone is watching him.
Right. He is sitting in the ashes outside the city while his community, his peers, watch him lose his status, his wealth, and his honor. His friends' speeches are an attempt to navigate that shame.
Or look at the court politics in Esther.
Exactly. The entire conflict is built on honor and humiliation. The villain, Haman, is obsessed with public honor, demanding that Mordecai bow to him.
And Haman's ultimate defeat isn't just death. It is public humiliation on the very gallows he built for his enemy.
It's all about status.
But it wasn't just happening in the royal courts. It was happening out in the dirt. In the agrarian economy, too. We see this brilliantly displayed in the Book of Ruth.
Yes, the social reality of a harvest economy governed by kinship households. The central survival mechanism in Ruth is the concept of the Goel, the kinsman redeemer.
Which sounds like a purely theological term to us. But in their world, it was literal economic policy.
It is the logic of levirate marriage. In an ancient agrarian society, land was your life.
If you didn't have land, you didn't eat.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If a man died without an heir, his widow was incredibly vulnerable. She had no safety net.
None at all.
The levirate law dictated that the deceased man's nearest male relative, the kinsman redeemer, was obligated to marry the widow, provide for her, and produce an heir.
All to inherit the dead man's land, keeping the property within the family lineage.
Right.
So the family lineage in Ruth isn't just a sweet romantic subplot. It is the raw economic survival of two destitute widows, Naomi and Ruth, navigating the harvest laws just to keep from starving to death.
Exactly. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the writings are embodied covenant life. It's flesh and blood people navigating farms, corporate imperial courts, ruined cities, and the agonizing silence of exile.
It's incredibly grounded. Now that we have fully grounded ourselves in the mud and the trauma of their world, let's actually open the texts.
Let's do it.
Based on the structure of the collection, we can group these books into functional categories. Let's start with the largest and most foundational section, the Worship and Wisdom core.
Okay.
This includes Psalms, Proverbs, Job, and Ecclesiastes.
This section forms the beating heart of the individual's daily instruction. It provides the vocabulary for both speaking to God and navigating the moral universe.
And it appropriately begins with the Book of Psalms.
The Hebrew title is Tehillim, which translates simply to praises. And within the book, many individual poems carry the superscription Mizmor.
What does that mean?
It indicates a psalm or a song accompanied by stringed instruments.
Okay, I was absolutely fascinated to learn that the Book of Psalms isn't just one long list of 150 songs. It actually has an internal structure.
It does. It is divided into 5 distinct books.
That's amazing. Why 5?
That 5-book structure is a massive canonical signal. It deliberately mirrors the 5 books of Moses, the Torah.
Oh, wow.
By arranging the Psalms this way, with each of the 5 sections ending in a doxology or a formal expression of praise, the compilers are making a major theological claim.
They are saying that just as God provided 5 books of instruction for life, Israel is responding with 5 books of worship.
Precisely. A life shaped by the Torah should produce a life of structured, comprehensive praise.
And you can't just wander into this collection randomly. The gateway to the entire Psalter is set up by Psalms 1 and 2.
Yes, the Wisdom Royal Gateway.
Right.
Psalm 1 is a wisdom psalm. It presents the blessed, righteous person who meditates on the Torah day and night, contrasting them with the wicked who are blown away like chaff.
And then immediately following it, Psalm 2 is a royal messianic psalm.
Yes. It speaks of God's anointed king reigning from Zion, facing the futile rebellion of the surrounding nations.
So if you want to properly sing the rest of the Psalms, you have to read them through these 2 lenses: a commitment to meditating on God's word and an absolute trust in God's ultimate unshakable kingship, even when the world is chaotic.
Precisely. And as you read through them, you encounter vital concepts that form the bedrock of Israelite theology.
Like what?
Well, you see the constant appeal to, here's God's steadfast, loyal, covenant love.
We'll talk more about that later, but it's a huge theme.
And you also encounter intriguing liturgical markers, like the Hebrew word Selah.
Oh, Selah, which always stumped me. You read this intense emotional poetry, and suddenly there's just the word Selah sitting there in the margin.
It is mysterious. While its exact musical definition is still debated by scholars, it is widely understood to be a liturgical marker.
Like a stage direction.
Sort of. It likely signifies a musical interlude, a pause. It is an instruction to the worshiper to stop, take a breath, and let the sheer weight of what was just sung settle over their soul.
It's the pause for reflection.
Yeah.
But once you learn how to pray, lament, and worship in the Psalms, the survival kit immediately hands you a manual for daily behavior, the book of Proverbs.
Proverbs introduces the pursuit of chokmah, the Hebrew word for wisdom.
Hokmah.
But we have to fundamentally reorient how we think about wisdom here. In modern Western culture, we treat the book of Proverbs like ancient self-help.
Yeah, we totally do. We mine it for pragmatic life hacks. 7 habits of highly effective Judeans.
Exactly. We think it's about cleverness or financial success.
Right, like how to win friends and influence people in the ancient Near East.
But in the context of the writings, chokmah is not a secular life hack. It is covenantal skill in living.
Skill in living, I like that.
It is profoundly moral and theological. Proverbs 1 verse 7 explicitly states that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge.
So it's tied directly to reverence.
True wisdom is the skill of aligning your daily choices. How you speak to your spouse, how you conduct your business, how you treat the poor, with the underlying moral order of God's creation.
It presents a universe that operates on cause and effect. Proverbs assumes that if you live according to this wise moral order, your life will generally be secure, peaceful, and blessed. Do good, get good. Do evil, get destroyed.
That is the general foundational rule of retribution theology.
Okay, general being the operative word there. Because here is where the brilliance of the survival kit really shines. Right after Proverbs tells you do good, get good, the compilers place the book of Job.
And Job is the ultimate catastrophic test case for retribution theology.
It really is.
Job forces the reader to confront the agonizing limitations of a simple cause and effect universe. The text goes out of its way to establish that Job is a profoundly righteous, blameless man who fears God.
He is the living embodiment of Proverbs.
And yet, he loses absolutely everything. His children are crushed in a disaster, his wealth is stolen, and his body is covered in agonizing sores.
And what happens? His 3 friends show up to comfort him, but they end up acting like defense attorneys for God.
It's tragic.
They basically quote a twisted, rigid version of Proverbs back to Job. They look at his suffering and say, Job, the formula is foolproof. Sin equals suffering.
They can't see past the formula.
You are suffering immensely, therefore you must have sinned immensely. Just confess whatever you did in secret, and God will give your stuff back.
They represent a rigid, dogmatic application of retribution theology that just cannot tolerate mystery. They would rather condemn their innocent friend than admit their theological formula has a flaw.
But the text is explicit. Job did not sin to deserve this.
Yeah.
His suffering is completely disconnected from his personal morality.
This is deeply unsettling.
And as if Job wasn't enough to shatter your neat categories, the collection then hands you the book of Ecclesiastes.
Ecclesiastes is an astonishing piece of literature. The author identifies himself as Kohelet, which translates to the assembler, the teacher, or the preacher.
And his central thesis revolves around the Hebrew word hebel, vapor, smoke, breath, vanity.
Hebel is the reality that everything is fleeting and impossible to grasp. Kohelet conducts an exhaustive investigation of human life under the sun, meaning the purely human, observable realm of existence.
He looked at everything we do.
He looks at our hard work, our accumulation of wealth, our desperate attempts to control our legacy and achieve greatness, and his conclusion is devastating.
It is all hebel. You do everything perfectly right, accumulate all the wisdom of Proverbs, and you will still die, and the universe will eventually forget you ever existed.
That's a tough pill to swallow.
So I have to stop and point out the massive glaring tension here. I'm holding the survival kit, and Proverbs is telling me, work hard, be righteous, and you will prosper.
Right.
But Job says, actually, sometimes you do everything right, and a tornado still destroys your house and kills your kids.
Also true.
And Ecclesiastes chimes in with, and even if you do prosper, it's all just smoke anyway, because the grave takes everyone.
Yeah.
How on earth do we reconcile this? Is the Hebrew Bible fundamentally arguing with itself?
What is so vital to understand is that the compilers of the canon are absolutely allowing a fierce debate to occur within its own pages, and they are doing so intentionally.
On purpose.
This tension is the point. Proverbs provides the necessary baseline. It gives you the general rule of how God structured the moral universe, but Job and Ecclesiastes provide the agonizing, necessary exceptions.
They are the boundaries.
They represent the strict limits of retribution theology.
They're the ultimate reality check for a community that just lost its temple. Because they need to know that their suffering isn't just a simple math equation.
Precisely. Job's story corrects the cruel assumption that suffering is always a punishment for personal sin.
And notice how God finally responds to Job at the end of the book. He speaks from a whirlwind. He doesn't give Job a neat mathematical equation explaining exactly why he suffered.
He doesn't read him the minutes of the divine council meeting.
No. Instead, God points to the unfathomable, terrifying complexity of the cosmos. The wild donkey, the ostrich, the sea monster Leviathan, the foundations of the earth.
He recenters reality not in human formulas, but in transcendent divine wisdom. It forces Job and the reader into a posture of absolute humility before a God whose ways are unsearchable.
And Ecclesiastes applies that same humility to human ambition.
Yes, and we must clarify an important interpretive issue here. Ecclesiastes is not a book of nihilism.
It sounds like it sometimes.
It does, but it is actually a book of profound, grounded realism. It is deeply anti-pretension and anti-self-sufficiency. By proving that we cannot control the outcomes of our lives through our own effort, Coelho frees us.
Frees us from the pressure.
He disciplines our ambition by reminding us that we are not God. Therefore, the most rational, faithful response is to stop striving for control and simply enjoy the immediate, simple gifts God provides.
Like food, drink, and companionship.
And as the very end of the book states, fear God and keep his commandments.
It really is a brilliantly balanced curriculum for the human soul. You desperately need Proverbs to keep you from making foolish, self-destructive choices.
Absolutely.
But you equally need Job and Ecclesiastes to keep you from becoming arrogant when your life goes well, or falling into despair when it all falls apart.
It holds you in the middle.
Now, while the wisdom books deal with these massive, universal human struggles, why do the righteous suffer? What is the meaning of life? The next major section of the writings focuses intensely on specific communal moments, seasonal festivals, and the harsh, practical realities of living far from home.
This brings us to the 5 Megillot, or the Festival Scrolls, along with the apocalyptic visions of Daniel.
And these books became deeply intertwined with the liturgical calendar and the ongoing life of the diaspora community.
They were very practical.
Let's explore these because the shift in tone is remarkable. We start with the Song of Songs, which, if we are being honest, has made a lot of people throughout history very uncomfortable.
It has.
It is highly explicit, highly romantic poetry. Historically, commentators have often tried to soften it by reading it purely as an allegory, saying it's just a metaphor for God's love for Israel or Christ's love for the church.
The allegorical reading has a long history, and there are certainly canonical echoes of divine love there. However, a sounder academic and evangelical approach to the text recognizes its primary literal meaning.
Which is?
It is a celebration of covenantal, embodied human love and sexual desire. It affirms that the physical body, intimacy, and human desire are profoundly good creational gifts given by God.
In a world that often either idolizes sexuality or completely demonizes it, the Song of Songs grounds physical love in the goodness of creation.
Exactly. It doesn't shy away from it.
Okay, but if Song of Songs is celebrating the joy of physical existence, how does that translate into the actual physical survival of a family line in a harsh world? That brings us right back to Ruth.
We touched on the goal, the kinsman redeemer, earlier.
Right, but the theological heartbeat of Ruth is his covenant loyalty.
Ruth is a masterpiece of quiet providence. There are no burning bushes in Ruth. The Red Sea does not part.
Just ordinary people.
You just have ordinary, vulnerable people, a grieving widow, a foreign Moabitess, and an honorable Judean farmer making faithful, costly choices to care for one another.
And through their daily obedience in the barley fields of Bethlehem, God quietly secures the genealogy that will eventually produce King David.
It teaches the community that God is active in the mundane, ordinary moments of loyalty.
But the transition from the golden wheat fields of Ruth to the smoldering ash heap of our next book has to be jarring. Lamentations is anything but ordinary.
It is devastating.
It is the raw, bleeding, unvarnished aftermath of the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem.
Lamentations is where the theology of the survival kit gets pushed to its absolute limit. How do you process the literal death of your city?
It's unimaginable.
The profound theology of Lamentations is that grief, bitter confession, and hope can coexist simultaneously. Even the ruined city can still pray.
What fascinates me is the mechanics of the book.
Yeah.
It isn't just someone screaming into the void. It is highly rigorously structured.
Yes, the majority of Lamentations is structured as a series of intricate acrostic poems, utilizing the Hebrew alphabet from Aleph to Tev.
Why do that? Why put such strict rules on your grief?
Because trauma shatters your ability to make sense of the world. By using an acrostic, the author is essentially taking the chaotic, overwhelming flood of their sorrow and forcing it into a highly structured, containing form.
Like giving it a container so it doesn't drown them.
It's as if they are trying to exhaust the entire alphabet of grief. They are saying everything that can be said, from A to Z.
That is so powerful.
It teaches the traumatized community that lamenting is not a failure of faith. Crying out in agony, demanding that God look at your suffering, is an act of profound faith.
You complain to God precisely because you believe he is sovereign and that he is listening.
Exactly.
Here's where the narrative gets really interesting, though. When we look at the final two books in this diaspora section, Daniel and Esther, we see a stark, almost jarring contrast in how they handle living as minorities under a hostile empire.
The contrast is deliberate and highly instructive.
Both main characters are operating in the absolute center of foreign imperial courts. Daniel is navigating the Babylonian and early Persian courts. Esther is navigating the Persian court in Susa, but their experiences of God's intervention could not be more different.
Look at Daniel. Daniel's experience is loud. It is supernatural. It is explosive.
He interprets impossible dreams. His friends are thrown into a blazing furnace and walk out unharmed.
Daniel is thrown into a den of starved lions, and angels physically shut the lions' mouths.
It is miraculous preservation. But then you turn the page to Esther, and the environment is entirely different. In fact, God's name is never even explicitly mentioned in the entire book of Esther.
It's a completely different vibe.
There are no angels, no miracles, no voices from heaven. She and Mordecai have to rely entirely on hidden political maneuvering and immense personal bravery to stop a government-sanctioned genocide.
What's fascinating here is how these two books complement each other to teach the diaspora community about the dual nature of God's sovereignty.
How so?
Well, Daniel teaches that God rules human history directly and decisively. He can break into the imperial reality with undeniable miraculous power, preserving his faithful witnesses and humiliating the empire's false gods.
And Esther. What does a book with no miracles and no mention of God teach a suffering community?
Esther teaches an equally vital truth. God preserves his people even when he appears totally absent from the narrative.
When the heavens are silent.
When there are no prophetic voices. When the massive, unfeeling bureaucracy of the empire has literally signed a death warrant against your ethnic group, God's hidden providence is still flawlessly at work.
He works through the random sleeplessness of a Persian king, the precise timing of a banquet, and the terrifying courage of an orphaned girl who decides to risk her own life.
Famously declaring, "If I perish, I perish."
Together, Ruth and Esther prove that divine providence often works entirely behind the scenes, utilizing the brave choices of ordinary people.
You might not get a lion's den miracle in your life, but you were still securely held in God's hidden hand.
And whether they were preserved miraculously like Daniel or politically like Esther, the community did survive.
It made it through.
And the ultimate goal of that survival, the reason they clung to these scrolls and maintained their identity in Babylon, was the burning hope that they would eventually return and rebuild.
Which brings us to the final historical books of the collection, Rebuilding the Identity. We're looking at Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles.
Let's start with Ezra and Nehemiah. We already talked about the decree of Cyrus that allowed them to go home. But this isn't a fairy tale ending where they walk into a pristine city and live happily ever after.
Not at all. The Persian period restoration is incredibly gritty. They return to a wasteland.
Yeah, they have to deal with hostile neighbors, economic depression, and internal corruption.
Ezra and Nehemiah focuses on the immense, frustrating labor of physically and spiritually rebuilding. You have Zerubbabel leading the rebuilding of the temple.
And you have Nehemiah acting as a stern administrator, organizing the people to rebuild the physical walls of Jerusalem while holding a trowel in one hand and a sword in the other.
It was literal blood, sweat, and tears.
And you have Ezra the scribe focusing on the spiritual walls. He institutes massive public readings of the Torah, driving the people to covenant reform and repentance.
They are actively, desperately trying to construct a society that is holy enough that it won't trigger another exile.
It is hard, imperfect work. But it sets the stage for the final book of the Hebrew Bible Chronicles.
Now, Chronicles can be a notoriously difficult book for modern readers.
Because it essentially retells a massive amount of history we already know from the books of Samuel and Kings. It traces genealogies all the way from Adam and then focuses heavily on David, Solomon, the temple construction, and the kings of Judah.
It covers a lot of ground.
I like to compare it to a documentary filmmaker doing a high-budget reboot of a beloved historical franchise for a new generation.
A reboot?
Yeah, the director's using the exact same historical footage, the same characters, but they edit the film to highlight very specific themes, cutting out certain failures and amplifying certain triumphs to push a hopeful agenda.
That analogy perfectly captures the work of the author, whom scholars call the chronicler. He is a brilliant theologian historian, likely writing in the late Persian period, decades after Ezra and Nehemiah.
So he's looking back on all of this.
Yes, he is writing for a post-exilic community that is back in the land, yes, but they are a tiny, vulnerable province in a massive empire. They don't have a king.
The glory days of David are long gone.
They are sitting in the dirt wondering, are we still the people of God? Does the ancient covenant still apply to us?
So why repeat the history? What is the specific agenda of this reboot?
He repeats the history because the traumatized community needed to internalize the covenant all over again. He isn't just reciting objective, encyclopedic facts.
You making a point.
He is representing the past to teach post-exilic Judah how to live in their current reality. Notice what the chronicler emphasizes. He focuses intensely on the tribe of Judah, the line of David, the importance of the temple, the Levites, and the temple musicians.
He is telling them, even without a king on the throne, your identity is secure. It is centered right here, around the faithful worship of God and adherence to the Torah.
And the canonical placement of Chronicles is the ultimate mic drop. It ends the entire Hebrew Bible with a decree of return.
Yes, it ends with the Edict of Cyrus. The Hebrew Bible does not end with an apocalyptic destruction. It ends with an open door.
By placing Chronicles at the very end, it looks back at the devastation of the exile, acknowledges the judgment, but leaves the eschatological hope of full restoration wide open.
It tells the reader, God has made a way back. The story is not over.
It's beautiful.
Okay, we have just walked through this massive, sprawling collection, from the opening praises of the Psalms, through the agonizing laments of Job, the practical grit of Proverbs, the startling, vaporous realism of Ecclesiastes.
It's quite a journey.
We've seen the quiet providence of Ruth and Esther, the bold visions of Daniel, all the way to the gritty rebuilding of Nehemiah, and the hopeful theological reboot of Chronicles.
We've covered a lot.
We have to synthesize all of this. What are the major theological threads tying this massive survival kit together?
If we look at the theological synthesis, one of the most profound, undeniable threads is Christology. How do these ancient texts point forward to ultimate redemption?
The New Testament writers repeatedly treat the writings as scripture that finds its ultimate, definitive fulfillment in Jesus of Nazareth.
You see it everywhere once you know what to look for. Jesus himself constantly appeals to the Psalms.
The royal Psalms, like Psalm 2 and Psalm 110, which speak of a coming victorious king, are applied directly to him.
The righteous sufferer in Psalm 22, the psalm that begins, my God, why have you forsaken me?" is the exact language Jesus uses while hanging on the cross.
The entire agonizing narrative of Job serves as a prototype of the innocent, suffering righteous one who is ultimately vindicated by God.
Furthermore, you have the preservation of the Davidic hope in Ruth and Chronicles, tracing the lineage that leads to the Messiah.
You have the awe-inspiring vision in Daniel 7 of the Son of Man receiving an eternal, indestructible kingdom from the Ancient of Days, a title Jesus claims for himself.
The writings provide the fundamental redemptive patterns that the gospel fulfills. The pattern of exile and return, the pattern of death and vindication, the pattern of humiliation followed by exaltation.
Another major thread we need to pull on is soteriology and anthropology, how we are saved and what it actually means to be a human being.
When you look at how these texts view human nature, our anthropology, it's incredibly humbling.
We are finite. We are made of dust. We are subject to the Hebel, the vapor of Ecclesiastes. We are not in control of our own destinies.
And because of that profound human limitation, salvation in the writings is not presented as a clinical, systematic theory of atonement.
It is presented as the raw, desperate necessity of covenant mercy.
It emphasizes the concept of shuv, the Hebrew word for repentance, which literally means to turn or return.
Deliverance is found when the broken community turns back to God, cries out in raw lament, and pleads for his hesed, his unmerited loyal love.
You see this vividly in Psalm 51, David's agonizing prayer of repentance, or in the middle of Lamentations 3, where the grieving author suddenly declares that the Lord's mercies never come to an end.
Let's bring this all the way down to the ground. Think about your own Tuesday morning commute, or folding laundry, or sitting at your desk.
How does an ancient post-crisis survival kit compiled during the Persian period actually change how you live today?
Exactly. Why does this matter to you right now?
It changes everything because the fundamental human condition has not changed. The geopolitical empires have different names, but the crises are the same.
The writings speak with piercing, surgical relevance to modern anxiety, to our encounters with systemic injustice, to profound personal grief, and to spiritual weariness.
Are you exhausted by the endless treadmill of modern consumerism and the crushing pressure to achieve status? Ecclesiastes offers a devastating, liberating critique of that exact idolatry.
Are you experiencing the dark night of the soul, facing depression, anger, or the trauma of sudden, inexplicable loss? The Psalms and Lamentations give you a divinely inspired, time-tested vocabulary for your darkest days.
They teach you that you are fully allowed to scream at the heavens so long as you keep your face turned toward heaven when you do it.
Are you working in a hostile corporate environment where your faith and your ethics feel completely marginalized? Daniel gives you a blueprint for maintaining faithful, uncompromising witness without losing your soul.
Do you feel like God is completely silent, that the miracles have stopped, and that he is absent from the narrative of your life? Esther reminds you that hidden providence is still flawless providence.
If we were to distill the absolute core takeaways from this entire deep dive, the writings teach us that our suffering does not automatically equal our sin.
They teach us that true, enduring wisdom is found in moral obedience to the Creator, not just in cleverness in the marketplace.
They teach us that God is completely worthy of our praise in moments of soaring prosperity and in moments of agonizing pain.
But most importantly, they teach us that exile is not the end of the story.
Exile is not the end of the story. We've journeyed from the opening declarative praises of the Psalter, standing in the gateway of wisdom, through the dark, terrifying valleys of Job's ashes and the ruined, weeping streets of Lamentations.
We've seen the quiet, steadfast loyalty in the barley fields of Bethlehem with Ruth, and the terrifying hidden political maneuvering in the royal courts of Susa with Esther.
And we've watched a traumatized community physically rebuild their walls with Nehemiah and spiritually reconstruct their memory with Chronicles.
It is the ultimate psychological and spiritual survival kit. It takes the shattered, disconnected pieces of a traumatized, exiled community and shows them exactly how to forge a resilient, living faith in the ruins.
It really does. And that brings us right back to our opening thought. When a disaster completely levels your world and the physical landmarks of your life are gone, you need a way to keep your identity alive.
Which leaves us with a final, essential question to consider. Well, the Hebrew Bible intentionally concludes with Chronicles, a text that looks unflinchingly back at the devastation of the exile, but deliberately ends with a decree of return, leaving the door wide open for future restoration.
So it's open-ended.
Exactly. So when you face a personal catastrophe, your own profound exile moment, when the structures of your career, your relationships, or your health collapse, do you view it as the definitive, tragic end of your story? Or, like the ancient authors of the writings, can you see the ruins of your past as the exact raw materials God will use to author your ultimate restoration?